Thank you again, everyone, for attending. This should be a very interesting discussion, and we'd like to have it as a kind of conversation where we have the opportunity to learn a little bit more about Brazil through the words of His Excellency Foreign Minister Patriota. But first of all, to welcome you to PRIO, I have Ambassador Helga Harnes. You may take the floor.
Thank you. Well, welcome to PRIO, and welcome to this conversation with His Excellency Antonio de Patriota. This seminar is in collaboration with NOREF, with NorLAR, and the Regions and Power Research Group at PRIO. Your Excellency, we think we are very fortunate to welcome you here, and we are very grateful that you are willing to share your thoughts on Brazil as a global actor and the challenges to the multilateral system. I know that it has taken quite an effort on your part and on our own ministry's part to find time for this visit to Norway, including the Oslo Forum. And we are very gratified that there was time to meet with researchers and other representatives of civil society. We know, of course, the importance of this visit to our country. The fact that Norwegian investments in Brazil are considerable, including those of our pension fund.
That's right.
And that Norway has even developed a Brazil strategy in order to engage with your country on as many levels as possible. However, we are not here to discuss bilateral relations. We are here to hear your thoughts on the emerging multilateral system and Brazil's important and pivotal role in this process, and among these, your role in relation to the G77, to the G20, and of course to your BRICS partners with whom you are cooperating. You have developed a new multilateral agenda, and we look forward to hear your thoughts about it and to hear about what Hillary Clinton, in reference to you, has called the multi-partner world. As a small nation, we have always been multilateralists, both by conviction and because it serves our national interests to form alliances with like-minded countries. Those that wish to strengthen multilateralism are thus of interest to us, both as coalition partners and as friends. And Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm very pleased to be here today. First of all, to have come to Norway, where I was invited to attend the Oslo Forum, and we had a very interesting discussion yesterday on precisely the issues that you've raised, multilateralism, Brazil's role. But just to speak very briefly on the bilateral front, to mention that this morning I had breakfast with Foreign Minister Espen Barth Eide, and I paid a courtesy call to his predecessor, Jonas Gahr Støre, because it was during the tenure of these two foreign ministers, and my predecessor and myself, that we've been experiencing this intensification of the relationship with Norway. And I think it's been a very happy discovery, a mutual discovery, because not only is the trade and investment agenda very robust, I think Brazil is the major recipient of Norwegian investment outside of the United States and Europe, or the major emerging power in this connection. Very important participation in our oil industry and our naval shipping industry and the platforms for the oil drilling and so on, in addition to other interests that involve fisheries. Today there is an educational interchange also with a growing number of Brazilian students coming to Norway to study in the sciences and learn in your institutions of excellence. So it's a very positive moment, a moment where we are discovering even greater potential for a relationship that is revealing also other aspects that I think are very promising. You mentioned Norway is a committed multilateralist, and so is Brazil. Norway has played a very significant role in mediation and trying to tackle some of the most challenging issues in peace and security, such as the Israel-Palestine question. And it's 20 years this year since the Oslo Accords. And I wish to pay tribute to the tenacity of Norwegian diplomacy in not shying away from these big challenges, because this is something that is in high demand in today's world. We often see rigid mindsets that are very uncompromising, and there's a need, a growing demand, I believe, for countries that are ready to take some risks and to speak to the different sides in some of these issues in order to try to find peaceful solutions to this conflict, to these conflicts also. I think that's another important point where Brazil and Norway converge, exhausting all the possibilities offered by diplomacy. So to speak a little bit about Brazil and how we see the multilateral context, particularly in terms of the peace and security challenges, let me recall briefly that this year can be seen, well, in a historical perspective, as the 10th year since the Labor Party, or the Workers' Party, has been in power in Brazil, the PT, as we call it, after a historical election in 2002, when the first working class president of Brazil was elected, Lula, as he is known to us, or Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. And he brought into his government, I think, a new perspective on foreign policy, one which was more universalist in terms of the way Brazil looked at the world, trying to engage with the entire membership of the international community, the entire membership of the United Nations, obviously with very strong emphasis in regional integration and looking at new mechanisms to enhance our regional partnerships. So in addition to the Mercosur trading bloc, which already included Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, today also includes Venezuela, soon will include Bolivia. Ecuador has expressed a desire to join. It was under Lula that a South American mechanism for integration and coordination came into being. First with a CASA, CASA acronym, which means house, the South American Community of Nations, and ultimately as UNASUL in Portuguese, or UNASUR in Spanish with an R at the end, which is the Union of South American countries. When I speak of this universal bend or a trend in the foreign policy, this was reflected in a very significant increase in the number of embassies that were established in the world. In fact, I know that you're a specialist on Turkey, and there's an interesting piece of information that over the past 10 years, the two countries that most increased their international presence through the opening of embassies were Brazil and Turkey, precisely. Close to 40 new embassies, many in Africa, but also the Middle East, and the countries that emerged out of the former Yugoslavia, out of the former Soviet Union, others in the Far East, or even in the Pacific Islands. And we were very gratified to see that there was a reciprocal movement in the other direction, a growing number of countries establishing embassies in Brasilia, to a point where today Brasilia is among the 14th or 13th capital in the world with the largest number of foreign embassies, which is not a small accomplishment when you think that Brasilia is only 52 years old. It's a young city. It's way in the center of Brazil, with connections to the rest of the world that are less than ideal, as the ambassador will know. You usually have to fly first to Rio or São Paulo to reach Brasilia. So this is not a minor accomplishment. And in the same vein, and during the Lula government, I was, well, first chief of staff to the former foreign minister, then I was ambassador to the United States, and during the last year and a half, I was deputy foreign minister. We also engaged in establishing diplomatic relations with the entire set of members of the United Nations. By then, there were about 20 countries with which we had no relations, no intergovernmental relations. So we went one by one. Many were in the Pacific Islands, a few in Africa, a few small micro European states like Monaco, Liechtenstein, and others with which we also decided to establish contact. So today, we're among, I think, less than 20 countries in the world that have diplomatic relations with every single member of the UN. And, as I always point out, with Palestine as well, which is not yet a member of the United Nations, but we hope will be soon, already a member of UNESCO and now an observer state. I mentioned the strong regional anchor. I mentioned this universal aspiration, which now reflects itself in embassies and diplomatic relations. But I'd also like to point out the very strong commitment to multilateralism, which I think is the focus here with us today. And in this respect, well, we have always been very active members of the UN and all the agencies on one hand, or other international organizations such as WTO, that deal with trade, and also the financial Bretton Woods institutions, IMF, World Bank, etc. And since the G20 replaced the G7 or the G8, Brazil was included as a member and has been also active on that front. But perhaps what the new challenge is for the government of President Dilma Rousseff, who took over since 1st January 2011, has been to transform this global outreach, the stronger international profile, which is also a reflection of the many aspects in which Brazil has advanced in the past decade or so, becoming the 7th economy in terms of GDP, bringing millions of people out of poverty and increasing the middle class to the point where we are predominantly a middle class country. Out of close to 200 million inhabitants, more than 100 million would be defined as middle class, and very close to reaching what would have seemed an impossible objective even 10 years ago, which is eradicating extreme poverty from our social landscape. And this has been accomplished through a series of social programs that have been actually very clever in tackling the specific challenges and the specific manifestations of poverty in Brazil. One of the aspects here, and all the ladies will be interested perhaps in this, is that the social grants are usually channeled through the mother or through the female head of the family, because it was found that they administer resources more responsibly than the men in our society. And this has been instrumental in promoting improvements in well-being. Another important and interesting aspect of the success of these social programs is that they relied very heavily on more sophisticated census technologies. So mapping populations in the different states of Brazil, the urban centers, the remote areas of the country, and going after the pockets of extreme poverty, rather than waiting for mayors or governors or politicians or social groups to look for the government. The government went after the population and tried to map out through systems of registering individuals that have proven to be effective. So I just make this small digression to say that, and I think in Norway, I don't need to emphasize this point, but a country has more capital to invest in its diplomacy or its international affairs to the extent that it develops nationally, and it demonstrates at the national level a capacity to overcome some of its biggest challenges socially, economically. All of this, of course, and again, Brazil and Norway, very committed democracies within a strong process of democratic governance, which is in every part of the world has its own characteristics, specificities, and in Brazil is marked by, let's say, or contrast with years of military dictatorship that only ended, well, started in 1964, can be said to have ended through true democratic direct elections in 1990. So it's still a relatively recent process where democratically elected governments have been bringing democratic governance back into the picture, and also since the Workers' Party was elected, with this very strong emphasis on social empowerment, on reduction of inequality, which I think we both would agree in Norway and Brazil is also conducive to improved governance, more inclusive governance. Groups in Brazil that had been traditionally excluded from participating in the political process were brought into the political landscape, whether these are the workers, the labor unions, or women more directly. And we've elected the first female president in our history 3 years ago. So that is another sign. Let's say, a younger generation also emerging of leaders. And this is important because sometimes when you compare with other countries in the region that were also subject to military rule or dictatorships, you come across experiences where it has been more difficult for a younger generation of leaders to emerge. In many ways, I think Brazil has been fortunate that this is not the case. You have excellent governors, for example, who are in their early 40s and who are taking over with a strong sense of business leadership or economic development, and also strong democratic roots in practically all parts of the country, practically all regions of the country today, from a state like Acre, which is on the border with Peru, deep in the Amazon. Some excellent leadership emerging, including, well, an environmental leader who was herself a candidate for the presidency, Marina Silva, Jorge Viana, a senator, his brother, who today is governor, to the state of Pernambuco, where you have Eduardo Campos, also a young and potential candidate for the presidency in 2 years or perhaps in 6 years, not entirely clear yet, to Sérgio Cabral in Rio de Janeiro, and I could mention others. So just closing this digression to perhaps say that these developments domestically have allowed Brazil to participate in, I think, a more convincing way than before in international debates. And one of the points I was making recently in a speech in Brasilia, where we have an annual celebration of diplomacy, the Day of the Diplomat, the ambassador knows about this, was precisely the fact that you can find the imprints, the digital imprints of Brazilian thinking in any strategic, important global debate today. You can take, for example, sustainable development, which was a topic of Rio +20 conference that brought the international community to Rio last year around this time of the year. It was the largest United Nations sponsored conference, largest in many ways, not only through the participation of many high-level delegations from around the world, and the Prime Minister of Norway was there, but also in its openness to civil society groups, in the many parallel events that were organized to allow for these other voices to be heard through debates and panels that even reflected themselves through documents that were ultimately channeled to the government officials. So sustainable development today, which is the, let's say, all-encompassing term or concept around which one tries to reconcile economic growth, social development, and environmental awareness, and has generated a whole series of follow-up initiatives at the United Nations, from the Sustainable Development Goals that are being discussed in New York at the United Nations to new governance structures also to deal with environmental and economic and social challenges. This would be one example. I'm not going to go into every single area, but there are certainly other areas such as peace and security where we have also been very active. I was commenting yesterday at the Oslo Forum that if you go beyond the permanent 5 members of the Security Council that have amassed considerable experience in dealing with peace and security challenges and have a presence usually in these hotspots around the world where there are not too many countries that sit in the Security Council for 2-year periods, who can actually contribute with original ideas and with first-hand information from the areas of instability. And today, through this expanded network of embassies and of governmental presence, well, Brazil is in a much improved condition to be able to do that. From having a presence, for example, in Sudan, where we follow the issues involving South Sudan or Abyei or Darfur, to Israel-Palestine would be not as good an example, but perhaps the DRC, Cyprus, Haiti, any number of topics that are on the Security Council agenda. There are very few where, in fact, you will find that Brazil is not present on the ground with first-hand analysis and information on what is taking place. And an interesting area where we were able to provide some input that I think was appreciated internationally, there were references to this yesterday in the Oslo Forum, is the protection of civilians under situations of conflict. You are familiar with the R2P concept, the responsibility to protect. Brazil came in while we were still sitting as a non-permanent member in 2011 and proposed that a complement to this concept should be the responsibility while protecting, being understood that when a Security Council resolution authorizes intervention somewhere in the world, whether it's Libya or potentially other parts of the Middle East or Africa or wherever the scene of the conflict takes place, it's not enough for those who intervene to feel that they have a mandate to protect civilians without taking very seriously the need for accountability to the international community of what they are doing or undertaking. In other words, they have to also demonstrate that they are exercising a responsibility as they protect or while they protect civilians. Because, as we know, there have been examples of possibly unintended but collateral damage that is of concern to countries such as my own, and I'm sure here in Norway as well. There have been other examples of interventions. In this case, I will refer to an intervention that was not authorized by the Security Council, such as the one in Iraq, that can be said to have actually increased instability or worsened the situation of the civilian population rather than improved it. And we must find ways of addressing these situations multilaterally so that these examples or these negative examples not be reproduced in the future. Well, this is my idea that we participate in the multilateral system by coming up with concepts and ideas that we share and that we discuss in order to improve and perfection the tools that we have to address some of the challenges. But, and I think I shouldn't speak for too much longer so that we have time for some exchange. Another way in which we have also been active in trying to consolidate, let's say, this new global outreach, this new awareness of our responsibility, even I could say, as a strong economy in the international community, has been through the presentation of Brazilian candidacies to occupy key positions in areas where we feel that we have a contribution to make. The first example that I would give is the FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization in Rome, where Brazil presented a candidate who had been responsible precisely for the kinds of social programs that I mentioned to you, the Bolsa Familia and the programs that eradicated hunger in Brazil. Now, this was accomplished through some very interesting agricultural strategies that combined many people sometimes associate Brazil with big agricultural, big business agriculture, extensive soya production and so on, where we indeed have made big strides and today can be considered one of the most competitive countries in the world. Beef, soya, we're among the first or second biggest exporter and producer. But another less well-known part of the story is the development in small-scale family agriculture, which today is responsible for providing more than 70% of all the consumption of food crops in Brazil. This has been quite revolutionary over the past decade or so. There was a period when we were an importer of agricultural products. Today, we're a big exporter, but not only that, we have been tapping into the small-scale family agriculture in order to create programs that feed into the public school system through free meals for young students in the public school system, and that also provide jobs and improve the livelihood of municipalities across, well, a very large landmass, as you know, such as the one in Brazil. So this candidacy was presented in a spirit of let's try to share some of these experiences that we've had in agricultural development, and it was, of course, gratifying to see that the world responded. It was a close election, but we ended up prevailing. And more recently, to give another, I think, a very emblematic example, we elected a Brazilian to World Trade Organization, an organization that had been predominantly in the hands of developed country leaders, with one exception, the Thai representative Supachai, during a period when, in fact, a decision was taken at WTO to split a 5-year, I believe it was, term into two because the two candidates were too close, so New Zealand and Thailand shared that mandate. And now a Brazilian national, Roberto Azevedo, has been elected, and again, I think it's recognition of very strong commitment to the multilateral trading system, a capacity which is maybe a trait that we share with Norway to some extent as well, of bridging gaps between different groups, whether it's the developed north and the developing south, or whether it's small landlocked countries, island countries that have specific interests, the least developed countries, and so on. As we look towards the future, and you can see these new experiments and trying to enhance our regional integration efforts, this new global outreach, this presence in international organizations, this capacity to influence some of the strategic debates. We are looking very carefully at some of the governance challenges that we will have to face in the future. And in this respect, I think there are examples that point to a positive evolution in the past few years. The transition from G7 to G20, for example, being perhaps the most obvious example. It was the product of the 2008 economic crisis in the United States, on one hand, and it was a recognition that in order to promote true, effective global coordination on financial issues, well, you couldn't just sit around a table with the United States, Canada, Japan, and Western Europe. There were some key actors outside this restricted group that had an important role to play in devising strategies, but also in implementing, helping to implement the strategies. If you keep, well, what today is the second largest economy in the world, China, outside this discussion, how will you tackle some of the challenges that are precisely created due to Chinese policies or exchange rate policies or other strategies that China adopts? And similarly, I think the same was recognized with respect to the other BRICS countries, another grouping that emerged over the past few years in which Brazil is taking an active role. So on the financial coordination front, We have evolved. There's still some improvement to be made, I think, for example, in the implementation of the quota system reform for the IMF and the World Bank. It is not fully put into place, and even though here we have a blueprint for advancing that will allow for countries such as Brazil, Russia, and others to have a voice that is more commensurate with their economic power. But there are other areas where we have yet to advance. I mentioned that Rio +20 tackled the sustainable development governance challenges. There was a consensus that UNEP, the United Nations Environment Program that is headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya, should be strengthened and made universal rather than just participation through election with a restricted membership. But additional discussions are taking place. And of course, maybe the most significant of all, Security Council reform, which has been eluding the international community for more than 20 years, but is becoming more urgent than ever because as the Arab Spring turbulence presents the international community with new challenges in places such as Syria and Libya and elsewhere, with some unresolved conflicts that come from several decades ago, as Israel-Palestine, without any movement. Norway made a very big and significant contribution 20 years ago through the process that was then created, but that did not lead to the two-state solution that everyone has been, well, everyone, I should say, the great majority of the international community has been supporting. So it's clear that there is something wrong with the current mechanism, that the membership is outdated, that the permanent members don't reflect today's distribution of economic power or geopolitical influence. And for those who are committed to multilateralism, as Norway and Brazil are, and are committed to diplomacy as a preferred way of settling disputes or to any Pacific instrument to settle disputes, I think it's very important to start raising our voices, perhaps beyond that which has been the case in the past few years, reaching out more to civil society. And this is something that I'm doing more and more in my trips and within Brazil. I've just announced the creation of a forum for the foreign ministry and the government to discuss foreign policy with civil society within Brazil, so that there is enhanced awareness of the role that governance structures have over outcomes that will produce stability, peace, and the kind of international context that will allow for a world of cooperation to gain deeper roots. And I'll conclude with the thought that, well, many today, and this is become a truism, point out that we are evolving from a more unipolar international distribution of power to a more multipolar world. But the multipolar world that will emerge if countries sit back and assist passively to this emergence could be one of lack of communication, could be one of rivalry that leads to enhanced tensions, rivalries between, for example, the Muslim world and the Christian world, or between North and South, or between China and the United States. So unless you have active countries that believe in multilateralism, believe in diplomacy, are ready to engage and to take risks, are ready to participate in these debates in a worldwide sense, unless you have countries that work towards the creation of a cooperative multipolar setting, it's not obvious that it will emerge on its own. So this is one of the motivations behind Brazil's work, bilaterally with an increasing number of partners, through the UN system, through the multilateral system, so that we create governance structures that ensure stability, peace, cooperation, in order to promote improved livelihoods across the globe for the greatest possible number of people. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for giving us such a broad picture of both what are the domestic the domestic changes in Brazil, which are in fact the force behind Brazil's rising as an important international actor. And I think you said something very well when you said that this is a time for new international actors to also define the kind of multipolar world we'd like to see. And with those comments, I'd like to pass the floor on to Dr. Benedicte Bull, who is the leader of the Norwegian Latin America Research Network, as well as an associate professor at the Center for Development and the Environment at the University of Oslo. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank you warmly for sharing your thoughts with us on very many different issues. Actually, it's hard to comment on all of it. For reaching out to civil society, as you said that you're increasingly doing, but also to the academic community working on Latin America and Brazil here in Norway, and to Brazil's friends of, and a lot of friends of Brazil in Norway. I know there's also many people that would have liked to be here, but it's a quite complicated date. We have discussed for a long time Brazil's way to becoming one of the major powers in the world. I think that was one of the major motivations for Norway to elaborate a Brazil strategy a few years ago, a process that some of us here present had the fortune to be a part of. There were many people from the academic community, NGOs, and the business community. And I think this was a process that did confirm, judging from the commitment by all the parties, that that really there is a great engagement in Brazil, and that Brazil, to a significant extent, is already considered to be a great power. It was a very strong acknowledgement that Brazil is an important partner beyond what it can offer in terms of economic interests that are strong. That was also emphasized here, but also, for example, from the perspective of the academic community that I represent. I think from our perspective that work on Latin America and not only on Brazil, one thing that we feel reassured about is that Brazil will not slip out of focus. Regarding the rest of Latin America, it's always a bit of a that can change. However, as you have also discussed today, the process towards becoming a global power is not without its obstacles and hindrances. You have mentioned some of the hindrances that are found in the very rigid, at least in part, multilateral system. You have achieved some made some major achievements in terms of reforming that system and leading that system. Now, the last major piece of news was, of course, the new director of the World Trade Organization. But there are, of course, many other, there's remaining obstacles. You mentioned Security Councils and other for you to be able to make those major contributions that I'm sure Brazil can make to resolving the world's problems. I think here in the Nordic countries, maybe Brazil is better known for its leadership in terms of economic governance than it is for its role in peace and security, although that is also, of course, very significant. However, I would like to just discuss briefly a couple of other maybe challenges, because you also said that only a country that develops at home can really provide strong leadership beyond its own borders, and I'm thoroughly convinced on that. And Brazil has a lot to show for in terms of internal development in the last years. But of course, on a day like today, and taking this last week into account, there's also quite surprising processes going on in Brazil, and the massive protests that we all have observed I think it has surprised much more savvy observers of Brazilian politics than I am. And was thinking that Brazil now has its own indignados that you've seen in many other countries. You've seen it in Chile as, I think, the only other country in Latin America, a group of a kind of spontaneous protests. In this case, protesting, starting with, you all know, from a rise in public transport prices. That is not to be that should be acknowledged as a major issue in many countries in Latin America, but also in many ways against the growing pains of growth and against the remains of the past in the forms of police violence, corruption, and inequality. I think that this might be one of the clearest signs that Brazil is actually now not to be called a developing country or a third world country, because people are actually expecting a lot more from Brazil internally and externally now than they used to be. You wouldn't hear the kind of comments that you might have heard some years ago that, oh, this is a corrupt country, it's a third world country, it has a lot of inequality or authoritarian structures. That's just what you have to live with. People don't want to live with that anymore. People have high expectations on a country that is both democratic and becoming increasingly a major power in the region and beyond. Many of my colleagues from other Latin American countries have very much notified President Rousseff's or acknowledged her positively, her way of dealing with this. But of course, to be able to deal with the whole institutional apparatus is a different question. In any case, I think this might be one of the major litmus tests on Brazil's commitment to democracy and a commitment to progress for its entire population, that it will be very important and interesting to follow. And the second little point I would like to make is the relation to the Latin American region, of course, that I'm following a bit closer than only Brazil. I think there's very few other relationships of the same kind in the world, where Brazil is, on the one hand, primarily considered to be kind of a benign big brother. It's one of the very few great powers that nobody really fears, and that has no unresolved border disputes, for example, which is replete in Latin America in general. And that has happened in spite of Brazil being an increasingly important actor in the neighboring countries, important investor, and in some cases pursuing economic interests that are less in line with a policy, at least kind of politics at the rhetoric level of the neighboring countries than the official policies of Brazil are. But in spite of that, there is generally very, very positive sentiment towards Brazil in most Latin American countries. And just a small anecdote, when Argentina got the new pope, the responses from the neighboring countries were not overwhelmingly enthusiastic. It would have been a completely different issue if it were the Archbishop of Sao Paulo that had been elected, I think.
We were enthusiastic.
Yeah, you were.
I'll tell you why.
Well, I must confess that I know the country I know best is perhaps Chile, and there was little enthusiasm because of an Argentine pope. And there's, of course, no doubt that Brazil is the leader of Latin American international politics and regional integration in Latin America. I think that was came just exactly a year ago with the constitutional crisis in Paraguay. I think it was very noticeable that nobody really asked what the U.S. meant about this crisis. Everybody was looking towards what will be the reaction of Brazil. And that shows to me that Brazil is the leading power in Latin America, and there's no question about that. However, there is although there's no other leader, it doesn't mean that that Brazil leads all the processes or can control all the processes. And to me, we all know that both Mexico and Argentina, for example, are in the consensus group that opposes Brazil's permanency to the Security Council, but beyond that, there's a lot of different regional integration processes that go to some extent in different directions, and that can also be kind of difficult to handle. You mentioned the changes in Mercosur related to Venezuela's recent entry. Also, UNASUR and other organizations are it's quite uncertain where they're moving sometimes because of different constellations of power. And also, of course, the idea of Latin America. For me, that has worked a lot on Mexico and Central America. It was very noticeable in Lula's first years. His very kind of focus on South America as the major region in the Western Hemisphere. Later in his presidency, there was more an effort to include Mexico, Central America maybe particularly, but also Mexico. But still, it's still a process where you see the two parts of Latin America drifting in different directions in many issues, particularly economic. But I think these are just important factors to keep in mind in the analysis of Brazil's quest for global, not global power, but becoming one of a number of major global powers. And I think that requires us all to make a stronger effort to understand what is going on both at the regional and at the national level in Brazil. We as a research community has tried to do that through to strengthening the academic discussions with different communities of researchers and academics in Brazil and inviting them here. And I think that is really necessary to avoid that we end up in what you were mentioning, a multipolar world, but a world without communication. I think to that end, strengthening the knowledge about Brazil and strengthening the interchange of different experiences and communications between communities at not only at the state level, the national level, the political level, but also at the civil society and academic community level. Thank you.
Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much, Benedicta, for your insights into the regional perspective as well, because I think now we're sort of seeing what's happening at the national level, we're seeing the kind of regional dynamics, and I would like to take it back to the level of the United Nations. I'm not a Brazil specialist. As His Excellency pointed out, my area of interest is Turkey, and so my entrance into research on Brazil is through this concept of middle powers or rising powers. And I've been interested in reading up on this subject on the kinds of discussions that are around the question of UN reform. Because, of course, as you mentioned, Brazil's engagement internationally now has been growing. And at the same time, we see a UN that in many ways has lost both its relevance and its credibility. And so the idea that countries such as Brazil should perhaps have a place at the Security Council is growing. And that's the perspective from which I'd like to approach my few comments before I open the floor to the discussion. So with the increasing economic growth and the new generations of citizens that have been lifted out of poverty, rising powers such as Brazil and also others such as, of course, South of Africa, India, are seeking this political power which is commensurate with their economic standing. And the argument is that such a rising power will be able to increase the institution's representativeness and thus its credibility. This is in essence indisputable. However, there is a question of strengthening the relevance of the UN and by extension its capacity to fulfill its mandate. That, I think, is a much more open-ended question. As an example, today the UN Security Council is in paralysis over the question of Syria. Russia and China, as defenders of the principles of state sovereignty and non-intervention, argue against any UN action in the name of protecting civilians that they fear is actually a pretext for regime change. And the inability to take action in Syria comes at a cost, of course, most tragically for Syria and for the region, but also for the UN, which has a mandate to keep the international peace. And although I'm framing these introductory comments within the larger perspective of the BRICS countries, the approach might not in fact be that relevant, because one of the questions that often arises is to which extent there is a common understanding among rising powers that they are challenging the established agenda. And I think more importantly, as you alluded to, are they cooperating in trying to reshape it? In fact, when we discuss the role of rising powers more generally, the analysis often falls into a question of categorization. Are they status quo powers, or are they revisionist powers? In fact, to a certain degree, all new powers are non-status quo powers as they react to the international hierarchy and are questioning these established approaches. However, it's not the rise of new powers nor the decline of established ones that are actually the challenge to the system, but rather this uncertainty about what kind of a role they will take in the international, on the international scene. So what I would be more interested in discussing is what kind of a power Brazil would be within the United Nations Security Council. And this, of course, is an insight that's very difficult to gain from the outside looking in, because at its core is this issue of self-identity, and related to that, of course, the ambition to take on greater global responsibility. In my work with Turkey, which is a regional power that has rising power ambitions, I see that it fluctuates between two positions. On the one hand, it is a status quo power, a NATO member, an EU candidate, an ally of the West, and yet at times it also adopts a very revisionist position with regards to an increasingly more independent foreign policy. And I think both those elements reflect its changing identity. So I'd like to talk a little bit more about how that identity is developing in Brazil. So if I may, in my capacity as the moderator, ask the very first question, if the floor will allow me. How will Brazil, who has traditionally been focused on maintaining stability in its own neighborhood, move from a regional to a global power? And what kind of role can we expect it to play on the issue of intervention, which is so at the forefront at the moment?
Well, thank you. In fact, I thought that in the two comments there were so many interesting points and insights and analysis that, if you would allow me, I'd like to comment very briefly on some of the things I heard. That will lead to an answer to this question. Naturally. But one of them is the point made by Benedicte that Brazil seems to be quite unique among the emerging powers because it's seen as a benign big brother, and you know, there's truth in this, and there's also, let's say, there are also some pitfalls in this role that one has to become aware of. Now, what do I mean by that? In one sense, if you look at the BRICS countries, you know, we are the only one that has essentially peaceful, cooperative relations with all our neighbors. For reasons that have to do with geography, history, not necessarily something that is our merit intrinsically. But the truth is we don't have a situation like India with Pakistan or with Afghanistan. We don't have a situation like Russia in the Caucasus with Chechnya and others of the kind. We don't have problems like China has in Xinjiang or Tibet, or now emerging also in the South China Sea, a very difficult issue of mapping out the territory of this large and untapped region in the south of China. And, well, differently from the United States or some of the established powers, we are not a breeding ground for terrorist activity, or, you know, Al-Qaeda doesn't pursue Brazilians around the world. So it is true that we are in a quite unique category in that sense. But there's another phenomenon here which is one that is of concern to us, and President Lula used to point this out very often, is that our economy is growing at a more accelerated pace than that of many of our neighbors. So in the 80s, the Brazilian GDP represented, let's say, less than 40% of the GDP of South America, to look only at South America. Today, it represents almost 60% of the GDP of South America. Now, we don't want to become an island of prosperity or of increasing prosperity. within a neighborhood of countries that stagnate or don't accompany this growth in the same, within the same kind of rhythm. So whereas today, I think it's quite true to say that there is generally benign attitude and there are cooperative relations. If the distance is allowed to increase between Brazil and Paraguay or Bolivia or other countries, you could see more problematic phenomena emerging. And there's some signs of this, because there's increasing migration from Bolivia to Brazil, for example, or from Paraguay to Brazil, and this generates some resentment, because obviously, you know, the poor migrants, and you see this in Europe in ways that are much more acute, but that come from neighboring countries, they will not automatically adjust and find the same living conditions as the established population. So I just mentioned this because while it is true that we are in this unique position, I think we have to also deal with the realities and the challenges ahead. The other comment I thought was very interesting, because it's true that the protests that are taking place are a very new phenomenon, and you know, they haven't been fully analyzed yet, either by specialists in these things or the press. But I hadn't thought of drawing a parallel with Chile. But I think that's a very interesting parallel, because Chile is the country with the highest per capita income in Latin America today. And it was a country where spontaneous manifestations by students, people who are not the poorest people in society, actually, people who have benefited from the advances in the Chilean economy and the Chilean social standard of living, but a population that wants better education, improved conditions. Now that they have their basic needs provided for, they look towards a new horizon of possible achievements. And I think you're probably right. You know, there is a parallel to be drawn, and this is possibly true. When you look at the people who are manifesting in Brazil, they're not the lowest in the social scale. These are, you know, well-dressed, middle-class students, young people, who probably don't feel completely represented by any of the political parties in place, and they want their voice heard, and you know, they want better living conditions. So interestingly, I think this is a consequence of the many advances in Brazilian society, rather than a symptom of the shortcomings or of stagnation, which could be another source of unrest or manifestation. And then to come to, well, the world presence, I like very much the distinction you make between status quo. I wouldn't use the word revisionist. The term that I prefer to use is transformational, because I think you're absolutely right in pointing this out. You know, when you look at the BRICS, for example, many people, you know, put them all together and say these are emerging powers, but in actual fact, Russia is not an emerging power. It's a very established European power. It was one of the two world powers during the whole post-World War II period, during the bipolar era when the Soviet Union was in existence. And it's now redefining its international role in many ways and taking advantage, which I think is interesting for Russia, of this coalition with others, such as India, Brazil, South Africa. And in many ways, the closeness with China was already there also during, well, due to their communist roots. But if you look at these 5 countries, 2 of them are already permanent members of the Security Council. So they tend to be more status quo. I mean, why should they go out of their way and try to promote big changes in the United Nations if they are benefiting from the present structures? I see China in particular playing that kind of role at the UN today. You know, it's very much against opening the door to new permanent members due to grievances that it has, which are historically understandable with respect to Japan in particular, but also a sense that, you know, it's the only Asian power sitting in the Security Council. Why should it start to share, you know, the decision-making role with new countries? To some extent, I think Russia is more open-minded because it's aware of its demographical curve, The population is not growing at the same pace. It doesn't have the same weight as China, for example. It will need to partner with other countries. But obviously, Brazil and India in particular are very transformational in the sense, because probably for the first time in their history, certainly when I speak about Brazil, this is the case. But I think it's fair to say that about India as well, they have what I guess you could call global outreach, a capacity to have a world presence. And this not only in governmental terms. What's interesting in the case of Brazil, to some extent India, is the private sector is also going global. Very often when we open embassies in Africa or in Asia, or this is even happening in the Caribbean, the South Pacific, we arrive there to find big Brazilian companies already operating, and or a small Brazilian community of people who are working in these countries. I can give you an example. We opened an embassy recently in Oman, in the Gulf, which is a small country, population-wise. And there were hundreds of Brazilians there working for a big company called Vale that is well known for its activities in the Western, highly developed powers, or the established powers such as China and Russia, to allow these changes to take place. But what I think will distinguish Brazil's role in the future, and this comes to your question more specifically, are some of these unique traits. A country that is in peace and has cooperative relations with all its neighbors, has no enemies worldwide, has deliberately foregone the option of nuclear energy for military purposes. This is in our constitution, the commitment not to develop nuclear weapons, has created nuclear weapon-free zones in Latin America and weapons of mass destruction-free zones, so neither biological nor chemical, and that has a stake in promoting a multilateral system that is functional, that works for the greatest possible number of people, and of course for Brazilians, which is has to be any government's priority. And in this sense, I don't see too many other powers of similar size, economically or population-wise, or in terms of its network of embassies or its international presence, capable of developing these kinds of coalitions in order to promote, let's say, common causes of strategic importance to the world, whether it's on climate change, or on food security, or on energy security, on protection of civilians, peace and security, and the whole range of issues that are discussed multilaterally. So this is the kind of power Brazil is emerging as. You will not see Brazil engaging internationally in order to increase its sphere of influence, or to have military bases in Africa or in any other part of the world. Far from that. We don't want foreign military bases in our own part of the world. So it's an essential peaceful power that is interested in multilateralism, interested in diplomacy, interested in cooperation, and ready to raise its voice also in order to create a functional international system. I just conclude with one comment that I made yesterday at the Oslo Forum, and that relates to, well, the so-called West. Because while, of course, we share many of the common values and aspirations, the importance attributed to democratic rule, to the protection and promotion of human rights, including rights that are at the forefront of the international agenda. For example, gay rights that were mentioned yesterday. You will see Brazil very progressive on all these issues. We see a multipolar world of cooperation, as I describe it, essentially incompatible with behavior that would fall under a category that I would call exceptionalist. And what I mean by this is, and we still have streaks of this in our current international environment, even though we are not, strictly speaking, in a unipolar world anymore, but there are instances of behavior where major powers, and one in particular that is the leader of the West, would take the kind of attitude that, well, we will coordinate multilaterally whenever we can, but we will go unilateral if, you know, something fundamental is at stake for us. And I find that the future world of multilateral cooperation that we envisage is incompatible with this attitude. So this will have to cease. And this is where I see an important role for a country like Norway, that is part of NATO, that has strong ties to the West, but that is also extremely aware of the importance of improving and enhancing multilateral structures, of pointing out to these distortions and saying, wait a minute, if you think that, you know, drones can perform in this way in Pakistan and Afghanistan without any international law coverage, or if you think that you can intervene without coverage from a Security Council resolution, or transform a resolution for protection of civilians into one for regime change, you know, others will believe that they can do this as well. And, you know, China's very soon going to overtake the United States as the #1 economy. The Chinese don't behave in this way. They might have other shortcomings domestically or internationally, but they're essentially very respectful of status quo rules, including for the fact that they want to be an emerging power that, you know, is well accepted internationally. So, you know, this is something for all of us to meditate upon, because it will involve changing behaviors and attitudes that are very deeply ingrained in some capitals around the world.
Thank you very much. I think we could have had several hours with this discussion, because it's so interesting and very topical. I'm going to open the floor. I think we might have time for 2 questions. Could you please state your name and where you come from, and have a question and not a large commentary, so that we at least get into. Let's see.
Something with a question mark at the end.
Yes, please. That's preferable. Yes, in the back there.
Good afternoon to the panel. My name is Itumelum Makhetla. I'm a South African, and I'm a student at Hunan University in China. I'm particularly interested in the BRICS angle that Excellency pointed out too, and especially with the development of the developmental bank, which Brazil, China, South Africa, well, perhaps maybe I should just start by correction. South Africa also is one of those members which don't have any enemies around, and
that's true.
Same as Brazil. So the developmental bank that will be having a different mandate to the IMF and the traditional institutions that we know already. I wonder how it's going to work, because certainly within this new partnership of the BRICS, there are economies that are much bigger than others, and some who are not growing, to be honest, i.e. South African economy, which is sitting at a good 2.8 and for the past 5 years or so, and you're getting China and Brazil who are just excelling very well. Of course, the proportional representation of the creation of this bank will have ramifications that are political as well, in terms of who donates the most will have much more of a gravity in terms of a say politically as well. How is this dynamic going to be sorted out within this new alliance of BRICS? Thank you.
Thank you. Your Excellency, can I take one more question? Sure. And then at least we have maybe there, Maria? No.
Hello, my name is Maria Gabrielsen-Drumbert. I'm a senior researcher here at PRIO. I was very interested in what you said about the responsibility while protecting, and that Brazil put forward in 2011. And I would like to hear a little bit more about how you see that concept going from now. Is it a concept that Brazil would like to lobby for within, and to anchor more solidly within the UN? Or is it more a concept that you brought to the table, and then it's up to other partners as well to take it forward? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good questions. Well, the first question by our South African friend, he's right to point out South Africa is also in this category of countries that essentially would have no enemies and have a cooperative agenda to put forth. But just as food for thought, I think in Africa the situation is such that South Africa is going to face some rivalry from other countries in terms of who assumes the leading role, for example, in a future Security Council. because of, for example, sheer demographics. Nigeria is going to become a country of close to 200 million inhabitants by mid-century, and South Africa will probably stabilize at around 50 million people. How does one relate with that phenomenon? A similar evolution will not take place in Latin America. Brazil will remain by far the country with the largest population, territory, etc., for the foreseeable future. Let's put it that way, for this century, I would say. So, but that aside, the Development Bank is probably, along with this, what is it called again, the CRA? The Contingent Reserve Fund, right? Or Contingency Reserve Facility. The two most concrete projects coming out of the BRICS coordination, which I think is always good to remind ourselves, started out on financial and economic issues. It's assuming a broader kind of agenda that spills over into peace and security to some degree or other issues, but it's essentially, and at the core, a financial and economic coordination group. The best demonstration of this is the way that they meet and coordinate ahead of G20 meetings or ahead of IMF World Bank meetings in Washington. So these are the two very concrete projects that are coming out of these discussions. And I think they're a symptom of the changing times that we are living through, because the idea here is that, well, the World Bank or the IMF World Bank kind of twin agencies in Washington, they have acquired a, well, some would say, questionable reputation in some parts of the developing world, given the conditionalities that they impose. In Brazil, we never want to be submitted to IMF scrutiny the way we were in the 80s, for example, because the recipes that were given to us to come out of our crisis and overcome stagnation clearly did not work. And it was only when we went against the orthodoxy that we started developing the formulas that now today everyone wants to replicate, and we get increasing numbers of people from Africa and Asia and the developed world as well coming to Brazil and say, oh, this is such an interesting model. What are you doing that is working so right? Well, what we are doing is precisely what we are told not to do at some point when we were highly indebted. So there's this question of, the reputation of these agencies in the developing world. And the BRICS Development Bank, I think the idea is to promote some healthy competition worldwide in terms of financial resources or resources for economic development that are available through different kinds of parameters. I think it would be naive or unrealistic to say no conditionalities or lending at the lowest possible interest rates without any conditionality at all. But I think in a different spirit, in one a spirit of contributing to development. And I think specifically to Africa, it's very clear that this bank would have a focus on African development and an interest in contributing to your own efforts. But then you're right to point out that given the disparities in economic strength among the BRICS, the funds that will be put here will reflect some asymmetries, as is already taking place. You probably were aware that at the Los Cabos G20 meeting, the BRICS decided to contribute to the IMF reserves to deal with the international financial crisis, mainly with focus here in Europe. And already there, the percentages were quite different. I don't remember from memory, but something like China providing, the biggest chunk, and then Russia, India, Brazil, a similar, I think it was 15% each, Russia, India, Brazil, and then South Africa a bit less than the others. So I would guess that for the Development Bank, these same proportions would be more or less. Take a look at the Los Cabos outcomes, and that will give you an indication. And then to speak about the responsibility while protecting, actually, the honest answer to your question is I'm not sure whether we will continue lobbying actively or we will pause for reflection, because there is one, let me put it this way. When we presented the idea, it was in a heated debate about whether Libya had been a successful instance of implementation of the R2P concept. And since we felt that the Libyan intervention had produced some side effects that were problematic, and now we're living with those in Mali, for example, and elsewhere, we thought, let's not participate in the celebration of R2P too soon. There are other constraints that should be imposed on those who intervene. They have to be accountable also to the international community. And I even use a comparison or a metaphor with the role of the doctor in treating a patient. If a doctor treats a patient for a disease, but introduces other diseases into the patient or generates new symptoms, that patient can sue the doctor, and he has to be accountable. And likewise, the international community, if they intervene somewhere, but they create all these other problems in the vicinity and destabilize the whole region, they shouldn't be able to get away with it. And this is what we were kind of raising a yellow light by introducing this concept. But on the other hand, and this is why we are in a stage of pausing for reflection, we don't want to create the impression that we are in favor of military intervention to deal with humanitarian crisis or situations of vulnerability for civilians, because our emphasis is on the peaceful options, on prevention, first of all. I even wrote an article, maybe I'll send to you, trying to make this point. Don't interpret our participation in the R2P debate through RWP and other ideas as a sign that we are ready to contemplate military intervention as the preferred option to deal with these situations. That would be the wrong interpretation. The more correct interpretation would be, let us work with the international community in fulfilling our responsibilities, in solving long, intractable problems like Israel-Palestine before it becomes a humanitarian emergency and you have to intervene. Or let's have a good early warning system where you can see that civilians will be placed at risk in country X or Y, and do what it takes through diplomacy, through cooperation, so that we don't have to intervene. If a situation goes completely out of hand and, other remedies don't work, then I think we need to apply this litmus test. Will intervention improve the situation or make it worse? Because it would be irresponsible to intervene and make a situation worse. So that is the kind of debate that I think we need to have.
Thank you very much. Actually, you answered a little bit of the questions I had as well, I think, in my text. But I see that we are unfortunately running out of time. We could have you here for a much longer session. Thank you so much, Your Excellency, for coming, and thank you to the rest of the panel, Benedict de Bull and Helga Hernes. And I hope you come back at a later time for another discussion on Brazil. And thanks for choosing to engage with us in this way.
I hope that you come to Brazil maybe for discussions there.
Thank you.
Thank you.